When looking for the king of podcasts, you're at the wrong channel.
Well, excuse me!
Looking for good ideas for life? You're far from good hands.
Hey, bud, what's your problem?
If you think the listener is always right, you're far from the right place.
Out of order! Even in the future, nothing works!
Hosted by a Northeasterner by birth, but a rebel by choice.
Are you threatening me?
If you want a host that floats between love and madness,
and we know the night is always gonna be here anyway. Thinking of you's working up my appetite. Looking forward to a little afternoon delight.
then play on and listen to Crazy Train Radio.
All right, guys, listen to this blues riff and B. Watch me for the changes and try and keep up, okay?
Within the gaming world, there are your general gamers, but then there are those that enjoy the dark underbelly of gaming. If you're one of those that enjoy the dark underbelly of gaming, we certainly got the place to send you. Scorpion Lair Games. That's right, Scorpion Lair Games is the creators of the true crime hit Killers, the card game. Let's not forget they also have Killers Clothing Company, their profiler game, and things like the 5-Minute Murder channel on YouTube. And we certainly can't forget the new book that is certainly a hit, Beyond the Headliners, True Crimes, Myths, and Legends. Make sure you visit Jeff and the Scorpion Lair Games on Facebook and everywhere today.
I'm Marc Ralmondi, author of Say Hello to the Bad Guys, How Professional Wrestling's New World Order Changed America, and you are listening to Crazy Train Radio.
Hey folks, it's your least favorite host in the podcast world, Croc, Jonathan Steele. And boy, do we have a good one for you today.
Before we get started, folks, we also wanted to let everybody know that is listening to this interview. It is being recorded on the D&D Fitness Apparel line. D&D Fitness Apparel is a Memphis-based comedy and clothing startup brand that is helping you reclaim the quality gym wear that you want to have on, but also does all the talking for you because you want to be comfortable while you are there to
Pump you up.
Feel free to visit them at dndfitapparel.com. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, this next guest is coming on to talk about a compelling, gripping narrative of the history of a legendary wrestling faction, the NWO, New World Order. from their inception in 1996 to their influence on American pop culture today that we are still seeing. The book is Say Hello to the Bad Guys, and the author is Marc Ralmondi. Marc, welcome, and how are you, sir?
I'm great. How are you guys doing?
Right on. And obviously got Mike Lano with us, the longtime wrestling photographer. I'll start with the low hanging fruit when it comes to the book. And as someone who knows the modern history pretty well, besides history of the business, it feels like the story of the NWO and all has been told a lot since the inception and stuff. So the obvious question, why now put together the book?
Well, look, I mean, I think that the important thing about this book is not even so much that it's an NWO book. I think the important thing about this book is that it is a book that is about how professional wrestling has influenced America and pop culture and, even greater society, right? And that all started, I think, in the NWO era. The NWO was the catalyst for the Attitude Era, for that big boom period in the 90s. That was what set it off, right? That started everything. And the people that were watching wrestling back then, which was over 10 million combined on Monday nights in 98 and 99, right? They were mostly young men, preteens, teenagers, young adults, 20-somethings, right? And now all of us, myself included, right? I was 11 when the NWO started. Now we've all grown up and we're doing whatever we're doing in the country, whether we're lawyers, doctors, construction workers, writers, artists, musicians, whatever, politicians. But we all watched it back then and it all became part of us, right? It all really shaped our childhood, and now we're adults and it's still there. It's still within us. And if you look around, you know a little bit about wrestling, you see it in a lot of places. You see it in sports news, right? Talking heads, manufactured conflict. You see it on cable news. You see it in politics, the ability to manipulate the crowd and the masses. And that a lot of that comes from pro wrestling. And I would argue that a lot of that, which we're seeing now in the country and in the world, comes from that 90s period because we were all, young then, and we've all brought it with us now. And the NWO started it. It's the vehicle. So the NWO, it's a story, it's a book about the NWO, but it's also the NWO is a vehicle to talk about a much bigger thing and how much wrestling has impacted all of us.
Wait, you saying that the Goon and T.L. Hopper aren't the ones that can be a influential mark even on today's society?
It's crazy that you say that because I'm watching, and I went back and I watched more than 500 hours of WCW, and once in a while I'll kind of check. Yeah, I know, and I'm actually still married somehow after all that. But I went and then I flipped, I flipped over and I saw, well, what's on Raw this week while the NWO is causing mayhem on Nitro. And yeah, the debut of TL Hopper, like the Goon out there, the Body Donnas, right? Henry Godwin and Phineas, the pig farmers. And it's so clear why WCW started to win that battle then, because on the other channel, it was still kind of that early 90s cartoony, hokey type of stuff that was so incredibly uncool. And the NWO was the antithesis. It was extremely cool. And that's what kicked it all off, guys. I mean, that's such an important part of not just wrestling history, but I would argue pop culture history, because the 90s was the era of the anti-hero, the era of the villain becoming the protagonist, and the NWO was right there as a part of it.
Dr. Mike, would you like to kick off with a question?
Sure. Maybe, Jonathan, you could bring up the photo of Inoki. I want to say I love this. There's nothing more topical. Herjan busted open last week. I love the quote from Rick Rubin, who's people don't know, hopefully they do. He has resurrected careers like of Johnny Cash towards the end. And he loves wrestling, but he's like a mega genius record producer. He's had his own book. I think his own book came out about 2 years ago. Your quote at the beginning of your book, and the book is titled Say Hello to the Bad Guys by Marc Raimondi. The world is fake and wrestling is real. Do you know where that quote came from? Killer Kowalski back in the like the 60s. He would tell the boys in the locker room, total legend, used to fight Bruno Sammartino. So the NWA story, I just got the book, so I haven't been able to read it. You may or may not have it in there. I've covered MMA since my LA territory boss, Gene LaBelle, refed Inoki Ali in 76, boxer versus wrestler, which was like allegedly the first modern day MMA way before UFC. And you also cover your primary, Mark, you cover fight sports. I'm guessing boxing, MMA primarily before the wrestling, or have you covered wrestling prior to this great book?
So for 11 years, I covered the UFC mainly as my main regular job for 11 years. UFC, MMA, some boxing, and along with that, some wrestling. So I've been with ESPN for 6 years, and our combat sports vertical on ESPN.com is MMA, boxing, wrestling. So I did a little bit of all that, mostly the UFC. Last year, I took on a new role at ESPN. Now I cover the NFL. I cover the Atlanta Falcons.
Wow.
But I covered combat sports for 11 years.
Wow. This photo is basically where Bischoff first met Antonio Inoki and his number two. They were both wrestlers. Seiji Sakaguchi's on the far left. Inoki's attorney is way on the far left. That's Inoki in the middle, Bischoff.
And Antonio Pena there too, right?
Late great guy. Yeah, it's how topical because WWE purchasing AAA, which was Antonio Pena's baby. This was 1995, a press conference for Inoki's Peace Festival. But the NWO derivation, and Bischoff has admitted this, it came from many years prior to that in New Japan, where there was a group of legit MMA guys, it really wasn't called that then, led by the original first Tiger Mask, Satoru Sayama, took Nobuhiko Takada and Akira Maeda, who did the shoot kick on Andre the Giant, and one other guy, and they all quit. It was like 84. They quit New Japan, and then they formed this super group, Satoru Sayama and Sammy Sorinaka's group, you might have heard of them, UWF, which Kenny Shamrock kind of debuted, and Dean Joe Malenko, etc. And so Takada, who was anyway, so that group splits up, and all the shoot guys have their own groups in Japan, but one of them, which was worked, predetermined finishes, UWF 1, not the original UWF, they came in to do an invasion angle. It was Takada and some of the other guys that had actually wrestled, did the pro wrestling stuff in New Japan, but that group, UWF 1, coming in to take over New Japan. So that's kind of where Bischoff got this idea, started watching tapes, like you did. So it's kind of neat. It's kind of blending in those worlds. But I don't know if did you talk to Bischoff? Because I think you interviewed on Busted Open, you said you interviewed just a ton of folks that in all aspects or areas of WCW. And pre-96, boy, got to give you a lot of credit for putting up, you and your wife, with some of those dark days like 93, 94.
Well, I didn't go back that far. I only started like in the NW era in 96. But yeah, I did interview Eric Bischoff, and he was extremely cordial and extremely welcoming. I flew up to his home in Cody, Wyoming. I sat down with him for a couple of days. We talked at his place, and I met his wife. Like, just really, really nice people, and just so so helpful. He got nothing out of that other than sharing the story. And really, I'm just so grateful for his help. And I was really able to kind of like really go deep with him, and because of the amount of hours that we spoke, and it was really great. It was illuminating.
I don't know if Bischoff mentioned, you might have also interviewed Sonny Ono, as like his best friend who he brought in.
I did interview Sonny Ono as well, yeah.
But they both have that big, huge love of MMA, and Sonny has done, I think, either judo or karate, so they have an appreciation. They brought in more realism and some of that stuff. But it was pretty revolutionary because particularly Hall, so that was that one photo. I was going to try to send in some photos of Hall and Nash in their day, and then along with Hogan's. I wish your photo editor had gotten a hold of me. I could have sent you hundreds of backstage, though, with the guys getting in, their outfits and talking over matches, even though I was like a lower tier guy shooting at all of the nitros and pay-per-views. Not all, but a lot of them. I was like the only one that snuck by Doug Dillinger, WCW security guy, to shoot backstage. And now I'm blessed to have.
Let's talk before the paperback comes out because maybe we'll include some of that in the paperback.
Um, but these guys, Hall and Nash, changed everything too because they were cool heels, and they've gotten some criticism in some factions over the decades. However long it's been. I guess it's been 28, 29 years now. In like looking at particularly Hall, looking at someone like Lex Luger or the giant Paul White or Sting and just going, ooh, scary. Like these baby faces aren't scaring us, but nobody really ever done that in the business. It's like no sell. And they did it, and they did it in such a cool way that they were like getting over at times over, the baby faces, which is kind of the opposite of what talent probably wanted.
100%. That was a sticking point, right? Because everyone in WCW was kind of made to look like a geek. They were having a hard time getting over because the NWO, they were dominating, right? They were winning every beatdown, right? No one ever really got over on them as far as angles went. And they were doing it, Hall and Nash especially, where they were, like you said, so cool and funny. And like even though they were doing bad things, you wanted to root for them because they were such compelling, captivating characters. And that was very different than what we had seen before in wrestling. And I think that they were also just so of the time because cool heel, they existed in wrestling before, but Hall and Nash took it to a different level. And what was going on in the country was kind of very similar. People who were doing bad things were kind of being lionized, like John Gotti. That was he was so big in the 90s, as far as that. He was a bad guy. He was a gangster, right? He was a mafioso, but people loved him. He was popular. And that was just kind of the mood in the country at that time. Like the villains became the protagonists. And then you saw later on with like Breaking Bad and The Sopranos and shows like that where, they were following the bad guy as the lead character. And that was not something that really happened before the 90s. And I would argue the NWO, is right involved and as far as that, riding that wave.
Last thing really quickly. I don't know if that's gone out of style because
it hasn't.
It hasn't. If anything, it's grown, and the NWO like helped influence pop culture. When you say geeky, I think too, like I groaned when Nash threw Rey Mysterio against the production truck. And then ultra geeky was how Flair came across when he would try to battle as sort of a face, like defending WCW. They could even make the great Ric Flair look geeky, which is kind of sacrilege, but whatever, they did it and it got over and stuff. So I'll throw it back to Jonathan.
Well, obviously, you guys both mentioned talking to Bischoff and Sonny Ono and such. And obviously, I believe the number was somewhere around like 100 different folks you talked to, from production to in-ring to, across the board from that era. Is there anybody that you didn't get a chance to talk to that you wanted to talk with?
Hulk Hogan. Hulk Hogan is number one on my list. I was not able
I got a little bit with that, but go ahead.
Yeah, and I tried and I reached out to several intermediaries and went down to his beach shop in Clearwater and just didn't have any luck. I did speak to Jimmy Hart, who was incredible. We spoke for several hours and he helped me give kind of the Hulk Hogan perspective. Also interviewed Hulk Hogan's lawyer, Henry Holmes, his agent, Peter Young. So I talked to people like in his orbit, but I would have loved to have talked to him. I also was able to obtain about 2 hours of interviews with Hulk Hogan that have never been released before. And a lot of that is in the book as well. Same thing with Kevin Nash. I was able to get an interview with him that wasn't released. And I did talk to Kevin Nash for a little bit, didn't get to go down and talk to him in Daytona where he lives. And that was the plan, but it didn't come together. He's had an extremely difficult couple of years. And, I respect that. And I didn't want to put, really any pressure on him. But yeah, I would say Hogan, but pretty much everyone else, guys, like I feel really good about, painting the full picture of what was going on back then because I did talk to so many people, from the Buff Bagwells to the Scott Steiners to, the Sean Waltmans to the Conans and, guys like that, Booker T and, just so many.
All right, so I'll bring this up, and I guess you can kind of say works in that element too. The thing I want to bring up with Hogan is you've been in the journalist game for a while,
Yeah, yeah.
And obviously, Hogan has caught heat in the last couple years of,
Mhm.
let's just say, storytelling with or over exaggeration with some of
Mhm.
his stories and stuff. So, how much, and I'm not knocking Hulk, I was a fan growing up, all that stuff.
Mhm. Of course.
And so, how would you have, would, or how would you have felt from a credibility standpoint if you did have the opportunity to talk to him? Because of some of the things we heard over the past couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely understand all that stuff, but the thing is that as a journalist, like you corroborate everything, right? Someone tells you
Mhm.
something, you don't just, run with that. You have to try to
A
verify.
professional one does.
Yeah, and I like to think, I've been like for about 20 years, but my entire adult life has been as a journalist. So, yeah, I mean, regardless of all that stuff, I think that I would have done my best to try to corroborate anything, and I wouldn't have just run things that he said. And you verify, you fact check. That's just what you do. But I will say, I think it's kind of like, I think it's funny that there is some like embellishment in the Hulk Hogan stories, because if anyone doesn't need to embellish anything, it's Hulk Hogan. I mean, it's like the guy was the biggest star in the history of pro wrestling from like the mid 80s to the mid 90s, and then completely reinvented himself as the biggest heel in pro wrestling, leading to the biggest boom period in the business's history in the 90s. Why do you have to embellish anything? Like you have two legendary runs. One is a babyface and one is a heel. You're one of the biggest stars of all time. You're one of the most recognizable names in the history of a business and a history of entertainment. Why you gotta lie? You don't have to. You're Hulk freaking Hogan.
Hey, so obviously you talk about with the book the influence of the NWO in changing America and stuff. And we note you kind of mentioned it there in the beginning from different aspects of whether it be politics, whether it be that, yeah, sports, the ESPN talking heads, and different aspects. Where do you think the biggest influence is seen currently?
The biggest influence that's seen currently is kind of what we were talking about before about the villain, the anti-hero becoming who we love as Americans. We just love the anti-hero. I mean, like the idea of like the white meat baby face in the 80s is so passé even now in 2025. But you can feel it coming back a little bit. And maybe Cena was that for a little bit and Cody Rhodes now in wrestling. But I think as a culture, we still love the villains. How many movies and shows come out where the focus is on the villain or an anti-hero, a very flawed hero, right? I mean, I think that we've become obsessed with that. That's why, like a show like Ted Lasso, you guys are probably familiar with the show Ted Lasso around Apple TV. That's why that show was like thought to be so revolutionary, because it was just good. There was no edge to it, right? There was no grittiness. It was just like heartwarming. And that used to be the norm. That used to be the norm in the United States, like but in the 80s, 70s, you dial it back to what people consume, like those feel-good shows. And in the 90s, that all went away, and it still kind of went away. Everything is like, gritty and dark and violent, and the heroes or the villains, and vice versa. And then Ted Lasso comes along. It's like, oh wow, that's so unique. It's really not unique. It's just from a different time period. So I think that's the biggest influence that the 90s and that area of pro wrestling had, because you know, the NWO happened, and then Vince McMahon and the WWF went even harder in that direction, right? Stone Cold Steve Austin was the babyface, the biggest babyface, and he was an asshole. Like he was a jerk. You know what I mean? Like, any you could be thrown in jail for doing the stuff that Stone Cold did, and we loved it. We freaking loved it. And that is America. We love the anti-hero, and that all came from the NWO era in the 90s.
Dr. Mike?
I was going to say too, the Penguin HBO series shows that the NWO concept still popular, because that was an insanely popular show. Even the dedicated Joker movies in
Yep.
theaters until the Lady Gaga musical kind of ruined that.
Maybe they can make an NWO musical. What do you guys think? That would be something.
Who will play those roles?
That's a good question. That's a tough one. Might have to get back to you on that one.
Think about it, and we'll have it for the paperback.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that white meat baby face, because I think Cody's been like the only guy to do that, and so we're looking for Randy Orton to turn on him
Hmm.
upcoming. because Randy's
And
man.
even sorry to interrupt you, Dr. Mike, like even when Cena was at his height, he was, he was a pretty white meat baby face, but people hated him for it, right? Fans like didn't like that. They wanted more of an edge to his character. They were begging him to turn heel, and now he finally has. But, for a long time, that was the big criticism. He was too vanilla. They needed an edge. They needed some darkness to Cena. And that's why people booed him, and John Cena sucks, because we have that hunger, that thirst for the bad guy, say hello to the bad guy. That's what the book is kind of about.
There's been a lot of argument, and people have been saying, oh, the Bloodline, the greatest storyline ever in wrestling history. Well, I kind of beg to differ, because that only lasted a few years. How long did the whole NWO concept from Hall, being the first one out there, et cetera, to the Hogan turn, which is everybody still says that's the greatest not taken away from Cena, but greatest heel turn ever. It lasted longer until it sort of fizzled. I don't know if you covered this. I could never fathom it. Only lasted a couple of weeks, when Dusty Rhodes, part of Cody's dad, part of the NWO. I was trying to rack my brain before doing this today. How was that explained? Some of the stuff didn't make sense, but that's part of pro wrestling all the time.
Guys, by 98, a lot of stuff did not make sense in WCW. The creative was taking a hit, and then 99, it only got worse. And it's hard to kind of go back and try to, make sense of all that stuff. The Dusty Rhodes stuff is like, they could have done much more with that. Actually, funny story. So when Dusty Rhodes joined the NWO, he actually, Cody told me this when I interviewed Cody for the book, and I think it was I don't want to misquote him, but I think Dusty missed something in Cody's life. I think maybe like a wrestling meet or something, because he was at the pay-per-view or the Nitro where he turned heel and joined the NWO. And Dusty came home to Cody and thought that Cody would think that was so cool that his dad was in the NWO. He did not feel that way. He thought the opposite. He was actually upset, because he was like ride or die with WCW. He was a big Sting guy. So when his dad joined the NWO, it actually was almost like a betrayal, a little betrayal of him as well as a kid. I thought that was a really funny story.
Well, and you still see the influence to this day, because Rey Mysterio's LWO.
Right.
Yeah, the NWO got watered down, having like so many D-level wrestlers start joining it, and it was hard to keep track of who was there. But LWA is still going. But that was probably like the only side faction. I couldn't get why they were even part of the NWO, but Conan's group, all these talent guys, people seeing Eddie Guerrero for the first time, etc. So that's still big. I mean, it just shows why this book is a must read, and I must read it because I only just got it. So it wouldn't have been fair. I really think people are going to love it and dig through this, and and they'll probably have their questions answered and stuff. What were some of the fun things that you uncovered that you weren't aware of in interviewing zillions of pertinent, relevant people and stuff?
I mean, it's so many things. I mean, so many funny stories, like when Diamond Dallas Page got rappelled back up to the rafters by Sting on Nitro after an NWO beatdown, and DDP is afraid of heights, so he was freaking out. So like Bischoff pitched him this idea, right, that he was gonna go up into the rafters with Sting, and DDP was like, Bischoff thought that he was going to say no, but think of like what was going on in wrestling. DDP just wanted to be part of like a big angle, right? Because in that time in wrestling, things were so hot. If you get a big angle and your character catches fire, you could get put into the main event with these big names. You could make a lot more money. So even though he was afraid of heights, he said, "Yeah, okay, I'll do it." But then when it happened, it was a mess, because the end of the show on Nitro did not go as planned. The match ended early, and the book goes into more detail, but the match ended early, and they had to fill time. So like more wrestlers kept running in, and then Sting came down, and then the NWO attacked Sting, but they weren't really supposed to. And the whole time DDP is down, like face down on the mat outside the ring, hyperventilating because things are not going as planned, and he's afraid that further things are not going to go as planned, that something might happen to him, right? But eventually Sting, hooks him up. They go up to the top, and as soon as he gets to the top, DDP sees Sting, and there's like a light like right behind Sting. And DDP gets up there and he hugs Sting. He's like, "You really are Batman." He was like freaking out, so much so that, it's like a sensitive procedure. He was like rocking like the thing that was like holding them up. And the guys who were doing, who the stunt guys who were doing Sting's entrances were like, you gotta relax because we're all gonna fall off if you don't, stop freaking out. So just kind of a funny story there with DDP.
Was because last thing for right, this part of me here. Sting after the Owen Hart thing. Did you learn if there were any reservations or just let's take a zillion safety precautions? Because when he started doing that, the first time at least, I was thinking Owen Hart. I was going, wow.
Yeah, well, the Owen Hart came after. So
Okay, I'm sorry.
yeah, the Owen Hart thing was after. But when I talked to Sting actually told me a moment, and he actually said, I almost became Owen Hart before Owen Hart because the first time they tested it out, it was like in the middle of the night before they did it for the first time. They brought Sting and Bischoff to the arena. It was like 2 a.m. and they were testing it at the arena. I think it was in Boston. And the first time they did it with like a big sandbag that weighed like 250, which was around, Sting's weight was around like in that range. So they wanted to have something that they knew would be strong enough to hold him. So they did it with a sandbag, and it fell all the way down, boom, on the floor, and sand went everywhere. And Sting was like, F this. I'm not doing this. Is crazy. I'm not doing this. Eventually, they got it to work and they convinced him to do it. But the first time, if it hadn't been a sandbag, it would have been very, very bad.
Wow. Jonathan.
Curious to know, and yes, we recommend the book, obviously, but you have a background covering sports and from MMA to football and everything else. What led you down that road? And the other part here is after going through the process of putting this book together, can you see yourself doing another book?
Great question. So I always say this, that I wouldn't be doing anything right now if not for wrestling, because I was a fan of wrestling from the very beginning. From 5 years old, I became a big fan of wrestling, and I consumed like everything that I can get my hands on starting in 1990, right? So I'm 40, so I was 5 years old in 1990. Hogan versus Warrior in Toronto, WrestleMania 6. That was like my first big thing. My first, like, some of my earliest memories was watching wrestling, and then beyond. So the reason why I got into MMA is because y'all remember Blockbuster Video? I know younger folks probably don't remember Blockbuster, but I was there in the early 90s one day. It was a regular thing. I went with my dad and I was looking at the wrestling VHS tapes. And on the shelf, there was something that said it was called the Ultimate Fighting Championship. And it said that it was real fights, not, I knew wrestling was a work, right? And I was like, I gotta pick this up and see. And that was my first time watching the UFC and watching MMA. And I thought it was like, first of all, I didn't believe that it was going to be actually real, but it was. And then I was hooked from there. And so if I wasn't a wrestling fan and I was not, looking for wrestling tapes, I would have never, fallen in love with the UFC. And then I would have never become a reporter covering the UFC for so many years. So it really all goes back to wrestling. And, now I do the NFL. I did combat sports for so long, and the NFL is the NFL, right? It's the biggest thing in the US. And I thought it was a really cool opportunity to do. And, it's been a really fun challenge so far covering the Falcons. And then as far as another book, guys, like, yeah, I mean, I do want to do another book. This was a 4-year process. So, it's not going to be easy, but if the opportunity comes along, yeah, I want to do another wrestling book because I just love wrestling so much, and I think it's very misunderstood. There's a stigma, that some people have against it, and I'll never understand why that is. I think those people are kind of ignorant and closed-minded. But I just love to share my love for wrestling. So if that opportunity comes up and I can do another wrestling book, I'd love to do that.
Is there a story in mind that you'd want to do the book around?
Oh man, that's tough, man.
Because there's a lot of good books out currently in the past couple of years.
There are so many good books, and what the thing that like this book, if I were to do another one, I would want to do it in a similar fashion. So I'd want to take something that happened in wrestling and try to show like the influence, or try to show like how it fit into the cultural context. So something like that. That's probably what I'd want to do, because I think again, it's like my goal for this book and for anything else that I do in the future is not just to write something for wrestling fans, but to share wrestling with folks that are not fans and show them why it's amazing and it's beautiful and it's an art and it's for everyone, you know? So that would be kind of like that would be kind of the challenge and the goal for the next one as well.
Dr. Mike, you have anything else you'd like to bring in?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I was there at the earliest UFCs with Hoist Gracie, and actually the first MMA pay-per-views in the US were pre-taped Takata UWF 1 shows by Joe Hand, distributing them. That was before Bob Meyerowitz and I forget which Gracie it was. It might have been Elios.
Orion Gracie, Campbell McLaren, RTV. Yep.
All those earliest Hoist Gracie, Shamrock, Danny Severn, Chemo, etc. Guy Metzger, Tank Abbott. Maybe you could, maybe some MMA and wrestling. I've been upset because Ronda, you and I probably know Ronda Rousey very well. She absolutely loved, idolized wrestling. She had her training folks and her friends, and she got disillusioned with it, became a mom and all of that stuff. And now she's sadly gone, and she brought a lot of legitimacy and, almost like what Tyson had done to prop up WWF at the time. She did that for the company, and Shayna Baszler was just let go. So it's kind of upsetting to me that element, but there's a strong parallel or a link with MMA and wrestling, not just the TKO stuff now that they're a conjoined company. But what are your thoughts on that? I mean, you have to look like weren't there just two boxers that had and it was a worked because the wrestling fans, they had some kind of a brawl and the broadcasters were naysaying it and all the stunts we've seen with Conor McGregor, who's an admitted wrestling fan. So your thoughts on how MMA looks at pro wrestling, be it, obviously number one UFC because they've kind of quashed all competition. I don't even know if Bellator is promoting much now. Sadly, love Bellator.
Yeah. So completely agree with you. So I've always said that MMA is kind of a cousin of wrestling and that they're kind of like two sides of the same coin. They're the same business model to me, right? You're selling tickets, you're selling pay-per-views, and you're building stars, you're building storylines, right? Because that's what really the UFC is. It's an entertainment company like anything else. It's they're trying to build storylines and compelling, reasons for you to watch the same way that WWE does. It's true. And I would argue that all of the biggest stars in wrestling history, in MMA history, as far as like the UFC, people who really put butts in seats and who really drew money, I would say that all of them, or at least most of them, have some kind of a tie to wrestling, whether they watched it growing up and they understood the promotional aspect of it, or they were just, they had an affection for it, and they also were able to kind of emulate some of the stuff. I mean, we're talking about McGregor, Rousey, Brock Lesnar was in WWE before he came to the UFC. Even like GSP, who people probably don't realize was a big Shawn Michaels fan growing up. He was a big wrestling fan. The guys that really marketed themselves well, Chael Sonnen. I mean, he was basically just reciting pro wrestling promos for his entire, when he realized that was gonna be money, that was gonna draw, he started doing it, and he pulled from pro wrestling. So I would say the biggest stars really, really came, had some kind of a connection with wrestling, whether they were fans or something else. And those are the ones who really figured out how to brand themselves and how to build themselves from a marketing perspective to make the most money possible. And a lot of fighters don't do that. And I think that they probably should. I'm not saying all of them have to be like these over-the-top characters, right? But there's things that you can learn from how to talk to the media, how to talk in front of a crowd, how to, how to build yourself up as something more than what you are. And that all comes from wrestling.
And Chael, when he was living in Vegas, he came like 5 years in a row to our wrestling brotherhood that's almost 60 years old. I've been on the executive board for a long time, Cauliflower Alley. So he came and he'd sit and he managed a couple of heels. You can tell he loves wrestling. But the one and only Gorgeous George back in the 50s and 60s influenced Bob Dylan and Muhammad Ali, obviously,
and James Brown as well.
Probably some others. So yeah, it's all full circle stuff. So there's a lot of fodder for more books from the number one writer in MMA now. now with the NFL. What's going to happen with Travis Kelce and KC this year and stuff?
That's a great question. Is he going to marry?
He's going to shake it off. That's all.
Not sure. I'm not sure. But that's, I mean, you talk about pro wrestling and promotion, like, his relationship with Taylor Swift. That's like you're getting the rub, right? The NFL and the Chiefs get more popular because of his association with Taylor Swift, and there's a little bit of a wrestling element to that too. I'm not saying it's fake. I'm not saying it's a work.
Well, she's the heel. People say, "Oh, she's ruining football." At times, some people. So there's a book for you right there.
Yeah, but again, he'll sell. The attention that she gets. All press is good press, right? So even though some people might not like it, maybe women who would not normally watch the NFL are tuning in.
Yeah, bringing a brand new audience, or an audience that may not have been there in the numbers they are now. And young girls, how many young girls would sit, now they're probably sitting there watching Sunday football to get a glimpse of her, but they're being exposed to the product and hopefully loving the NFL.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Well, the book is Say Hello to the Bad Guys, How the Pro Wrestling's NWO Changed America. Mark, we'll have a link to Amazon on this as well. Barnes & Noble, all that fun stuff. Thank you so much.
Thank you guys a ton. Really, really appreciate it. It was a great conversation.
Hey folks, looking for the ultimate destination for the nerd enthusiasts and collectors? Well, we found the spot for you. Nerds Nest Collectibles is a haven for nerds, geeks, and fans alike, as they have many different products and certainly more to come. Make sure you go ahead and visit them at nerdsnestcollectibles.com. Check them out.
And this show rocks. It's hardcore. Ladies and gentlemen, you're listening to Crazy Train Radio.